Hey, everybody, welcome back to the podcast. You're listening to the longest running superhero role playing game on Earth. I'm your host, the Game Master, and in this one, we're going to be talking about the X-Men and specifically a story or a series of stories that has been repeated through multiple forms of media called the Days of Future Past. And the for those who don't know, by the way, the Days of Future Past story is really close to the original Terminator movie. In that, in both cases, there is a future era, at least it was the future in the 80s, you know what I mean? But there was this future where machines ruled, they hunted organic prey, and then time travel becomes a thing. And so we get one machine that goes back to the 80s, and then we get one of the resistance fighters goes back to the 80s. And of course, in the first Terminator movie, that resistance fighter is Kyle Reese, right? And the machine that goes back is the Terminator, right? The T-800, played by Arnold Schwarzenegger. Well, so Terminator was made by James Cameron. And James Cameron at one point was going to make a Spider-Man movie. In the 90s, like really in the late 80s, he was talking about making a Spider-Man movie. And through the 90s, apparently he was kind of trying. Obviously, it never happened. Um, and from what I've heard, that sort of slowly became Sam Raimi's Spider-Man movie from the early 2000s with Tobey Maguire, right? But the reason that I bring that up is in many interviews throughout the 1990s, when people would ask James Cameron about Spider-Man, something he said was how he's always been a fan of Marvel Comics, yada, yada, yada. He loves the comics so much. And so that just makes me wonder if he loves Marvel Comics, he surely would be familiar with Days of Future Past then. And it predates Terminator by about 4 years, you know? And so I know a lot of people point to there's an episode of The Twilight Zone that they think that is what inspired Terminator. But for my money, I feel like Days of Future Past is the better fit there. So, at any rate, in the original comic book, there's a future where machines rule, they hunt organic prey, they send a lone machine back, and this robot is called Nimrod. And a brief aside, a lot of people laugh at the name because they often they'll think of Bugs Bunny. There's an old Bugs Bunny cartoon where he uses the word Nimrod to refer to Elmer Fudd. And so a lot of kids, myself included, when I was little, assumed based on the context that Nimrod meant like an idiot or a fool, something like that. Well, it turns out Nimrod is actually a mighty hunter from the Bible. So Bugs Bunny was using sarcasm because Elmer Fudd is a hunter, but he's anything but mighty, right? So that is what the deal is with the name there. The X-Men have oftentimes referenced religion and politics and stuff like that with a lot of their naming conventions. So that's why this robot is called Nimrod, is he is the ultimate hunter, the ultimate sentinel, right? And then the lone member of the resistance who goes back in time is named Kate Pryde. And she is the older, kind of middle-aged version of Kitty Pryde. And we find out that there is this moment in history that's about to happen where mutants are going to hurt a politician. They're going to terminate him. And then the general public has such a strong reaction to this event that it sets the Days of Future Past timeline into motion. And the whole reason for the sentinels of the future, all these killer robots that are such a problem, is because the humans wanted the robots made, back in the 80s to hunt down the mutants once and for all, right? So Kate Pride teams up with the X-Men. They fight Nimrod. They win. If I remember correctly, I believe Kate Pride dies in the process, but she dies saving the world, right? So this horrible future where she was in this camp, where she was waiting to be terminated, basically. None of this is going to come to pass now, or so it would seem, because it turns out Nimrod actually survived. And one of the early things they were going to do with the Terminator movies is the original script for the first Terminator movie was going to have that Terminator to be more like the T-1000 that we see in the sequel, right? Where the T-1000 can morph into these various forms. Turns out that's something Nimrod can do. Nimrod is a shapeshifter. So in the comics, he disguises himself as a human being named Sebastian Gilberti, or Bastion for short. And Bastion infiltrates the government, gets involved with the Sentinel project because Sentinels do exist before 1980, right? But now he is working his way up through the ranks to head up the project so that he can try to steer the Sentinel program kind of back on course because he wants his future to happen, right? But the X-Men get wind of this because Bastion shows up in some comics in the 90s. I want to say it was the real late 90s, like 98 or 99, something like that. And the X-Men realize that, Nimrod has survived. They fight him multiple times, and the X-Men basically always win. So in our game, then, when we catch up to the date when all of this is supposed to happen, we didn't want it to be that, the world was ruined and everybody is in some sort of an internment camp. We didn't want to do that, but we wanted to reference it, right? And so what I did was I did an adventure with a Sentinel factory. And something that always bothered me, like for instance, I keep jumping back between X-Men and Terminator, but bear with me for a minute. So in Terminator, something I always thought was weird is we see all these T-800s, they're the commonplace thing. And then there's the T-1000, and it's so different than all the other robots. And to me, what would make sense is there should be some sort of in-betweens there, right? Um, and we kind of see that in some of the later movies where it's maybe like a T-800 style endoskeleton, but then over top of that is liquid metal. I think that was the chick from Terminator 3, right? After T2, I kind of quit paying attention in a way. I felt like the movies took a big nosedive. At any rate, I digress. But yeah, I just thought that in the future scenes, we kind of need something that bridges these extremes, right? And so for me, that same thought process applies to Nimrod and the Sentinels. Nimrod, to me, it looks like he's made out of some sort of like crystalline material. Um, he's a different appearance than the others, he's a different size than the others, so on and so forth. And it was always just a little weird to me. And I felt like we needed a million different flavors of Nimrods in the future, that would make sense. If you have the ability to make it, you're probably going to start incorporating that technology into the various products that you're putting out, right? So I ran an adventure then um, with a Sentinel factory, and I sort of abandoned the look of the classic Sentinels because in our game world, because we use real time, that means the classic Sentinels were around in the 1960s. And so I kind of looked at it like automobiles, right? Where think about what a car looked like in the 1960s and then think about what cars look like now. and they look different. You know what I mean? So I was doing that with the Sentinels, where I was saying, if Nimrod is the guy, and Nimrod seems to know how he himself was constructed, right? He seems to have those files in his memory banks, or however you want to refer to that. It totally made sense to me that we would get these big white sentinels, In other words, they would start to take on Nimrod's appearance, but then they would have sort of like the strength and the various advantages that the older style sentinels had. And then we had sentinels that were in between. We had other Nimrods that were his height, um, so on and so forth. But I tried to really represent what I thought it would be like if Nimrod was running the program. So that's what we dealt with. And then depending on who the heroes were, they had a really tough time with it. Because one of the things Nimrod has going on is he has this power called neutralize. So for instance, if he gets within, and I don't know what it is now, if it's 10 feet or something, the normal size Nimrod that's more kind of like man-sized, he gets within like 10 feet of you. And so let's say Cyclops is the person in question. If he gets within 10 feet of Cyclops, then Cyclops no longer has an optic blast. He just has like normal eyes now. You know what I mean? So that makes Nimrod incredibly difficult to deal with. And so I ran not just a single adventure, but multiple adventures where the Nimrods, plural, were going out through the world. And in this version, the world is pretty much fine, right? And the humans aren't that upset about this because the Nimrods aren't hunting humans, they're only hunting the mutants. So at any rate, I had multiple Nimrods, and depending on who they were fighting, it went really bad for that character. I remember Colossus at one point fought one, and he had to, he changed back into his flesh form. He lost his super strength. They just beat him down, and then they captured him. And then the facility where they were made had kind of like a holding cell where they were taking these characters back to. And then, of course, that was bait for the other player characters, where all the other mutants had to go to this place and try to get their friends back. And one of the most powerful combinations that we had was our Jean Grey. Actually, I guess it would be Jean Summers, because she's the daughter of Rachel Summers, who's actually the Phoenix from Days of Future Past, who had gone back in time. So when Rachel named her kids Jean and Scott after her own parents, right? So it'd be Jean Summers, right, who's Rachel's daughter, would use her telekinesis to pick one of the robots up off the ground so it couldn't keep walking towards them. And then her brother, Scott, was shooting him with optic blast and just whittling their hit points down. And so that's basically how our X-Men were able to deal with these guys. And then, as before, Nimrod is a survivor. He gets away. He is always making more, so on and so forth. But it was kind of a big deal in our game world because we really took the Sentinels, which have been a big part of our game over the years, actually. We've had more Sentinel adventures than like any other kind of adventure, honestly. And we really updated them a lot. And we just went completely away from what they'd been doing in the comics, where the Sentinels basically had the same appearance for 50 years or whatever. You know what I mean? So yeah, we introduced the white and pink Sentinels. And like I said, because they're gonna pop up in future games, and their appearances totally vary, you know. And the way I looked at that was kind of like, if you think of something like, um, well, I'll stick with my car analogy, you know. If you pick a company that makes cars like Chevy or something like that, all the different Chevy automobiles that the corporation manufactures have very different appearances, you know. And for instance, some are cars, some are trucks, blah, blah, blah. So some of the sentinels are small and they're able to like enter a building to go find somebody, you know what I mean? Because we go with the idea that the Sentinel program still has to kind of work in concert with like the law, you know what I mean? So like the idea that your military equipment just breaks through the front of a shopping mall to grab, Jubilee or something, taxpayers are not going to like that. So on the Sentinels end, if they want to keep doing what they do for now, anyways, right? They need to kind of rein it in a little bit. And so therefore having the more man-sized characters that can go in, grab a character, sort of arrest them, as far as the public is concerned, take them back to that holding cell. We thought that was the best fit. So that was how we handled that. But yeah, that was pretty much our Days of Future Past stuff that we did. Hopefully you found this to be interesting. If so, as always, we would love it if you took a second to support the channel by smashing that like button. Check to see if you're still subscribed because YouTube loves to unsubscribe people and not tell them. And as always, leave us a comment. Did you read the Days of Future Past comics? If so, what did you think? Did you see the movie they made? Did you like that? Whatever. Have you ever played the game? Because TSR's old Marvel superheroes had Days of Future Past stuff and that, that was pretty cool. But yeah, whatever the case may be, let me know in the comments section. And from everybody here at the longest running superhero role-playing game on Earth, we hope you have a good one, and we'll see you in the next adventure. Bye.